Hi everybody. If creating a Hello World app is kind of an example of getting familiar with something, creating a to-do list app is kind of a sign. It's a sign that you've learned enough to be really dangerous with whatever framework or library or technique you're trying to master. And so I think we've gotten to the point now in our learning of React that it's time for us to build our to-do list demo. To start by creating something that ties together all the various concepts we've learned and puts them into something that does something really nice end to end. So to see an example of what I want to talk about, just visit this URL. It looks kind of like this. Here you have a to-do list app. It's pretty straightforward as to-do list apps go. You have an area where you can enter some tasks and hit an add button to get them to show up. So for example, first one might be for me to wake up, which I sort of have, maybe. Wake up, record video, post on Twitter, feed cat. All right, so here's an example of task that I've added. And notice that for each task I'm adding, it's not just appearing suddenly, it's actually animating in. So notice the animations, hit enter. Notice that the tasks, they kind of fade in, scale in. It's kind of neat. And when I hover over them, there's a treatment that kind of makes it indicate that maybe by clicking on it, I can remove it. And when I remove it, you can see that the task disappears and everything just slides appropriately into place to make up for the lost space, the removed task left behind. So that's really our to-do app in a very quick nutshell, a very simple way of just displaying a list of items and being able to remove them. It's not fancy, there's no reordering, there's no adding notifications if things were to be wrapped up. That's all stuff we'll take care of one day. But in this one, we're going to keep it pretty simple and just focus on the main React concepts behind building an app like this. All right, so here's the thing. Watching someone code on screen for a bunch of minutes, it's not fun. And I get it. You're going to be basically sitting here, very few slides, watching me write code, switch to another file, write some more code, test stuff, and if you're lucky, I might make a few mistakes here and there, and you'll get to see me sweat as I try to use the debug tools to figure out what exactly went wrong. And I get it's not a lot of fun, but what you can do is, you saw the example of what the to-do list app should look like, and you can pause this video for a bit, try to build this up on your own, and then come back and see how I'm doing it. Or you can just grab some popcorn, lay back, and go ahead and watch me build a to-do app list directly. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is going to be very code heavy, so there are no slides beyond this. So let's go to the terminal first. Let me actually just, exit from PowerPoint. Go to the terminal, and we're going to use create React app to go ahead and build a to-do list example. So I'm going to go to my desktop and create React app. Let's call this to-do list. And this will take a few seconds while the app is currently being, all the dependencies are being downloaded, created, and the project is ultimately being set up. And the speed of this depends on a variety of things, your network connection, whether you have antivirus software running or not, and so on. So we'll let this go on for a few more moments. I could edit this part out, but where's the fun in that? It's a lot more fun to just watch me try to make up for, add some white noise, basically, with words. All right, so our project has now been set up. Let me go ahead and go into the folder, cd to-do list, and npm start, just to have it running in the background. All right, so now we have the app in its current state displaying. And let me zoom in a bit. See, nothing surprising here. This is what you'd kind of expect, right? So now what we're going to do, though, is start modifying the project that was created to start adding the things for our to-do list example. So the first thing I'm going to do is, let's go ahead and bring up VS Code. And I'm going to go and open this folder up. Open. Let's go to desktop, to-do list. All right. So it'll take a few moments, but now I can see the project. Let me zoom in a bit here. You can now see the project that we built appearing in this location. So the first thing I'm going to do is, just like I'll generally do when I'm using create React app, is that a lot of files and things are being created for you. And it's actually pretty valuable. They build up a service worker and a manifest.json to help you get a progressive web app up and running and so on. But for what we're trying to do, though, I just want to keep it very empty, keep it very plain. So I'm going to go ahead and delete everything inside my public folder. You do not ask me again. Yep. And delete everything inside my my source folder as well. Great. So now we have pretty much a blank slate from which we're going to be creating everything from. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this index.html. Now, you're going to see me writing a lot of code, copying and pasting as well, but just for the early parts of it, I'm going to be writing it all manually. In fact, I might not even use any copy paste at all. So doc type HTML, we're just creating the starting point for our application. HTML lang equals en. You don't have to put the en flag, but I like to do it because why not? All the cool kids seem to be doing that. Okay, so head, title, to-do list. All right. And now let's do body. Inside here, we're going to have a div element with an ID value of container. So this will be, you can imagine where all of our content will one day ultimately get loaded into. And let's clear up the spacing a bit. And there we have index.html. Pretty straightforward. And now in our source directory, let's go ahead and add some styling to this. Add this file index.css. So right now, as you can see, our page is very minimal. That's okay. We'll build this CSS and build our page up as time goes on. So body padding is 50 pixels. Background color, it's going to be #66 CCFF. We're trying to replicate the exact example we saw a few moments ago, but feel free to use your own creative talents to modify the various CSS values you're going to be seeing in a few moments. So I'm going to create the traditional blue background with a sans serif font. And now the container display flex, justify content flex. You know, gotta love the way you can build things now with Flexbox and Grid, where something like this would have been very difficult to do and involved a lot of other stuff along the way. All right, so now we have our index.css done. Now, the way, as you may have seen in the earlier videos, is to make this all work, you need a JavaScript file. That's really the entry point to your page that happens to control so much of the dependencies and what gets included and so on. So I'm going to now create index.js in my source folder again. And here it's going to go import React from React, import React DOM from React DOM, and of course import the CSS file we just created. This just basically tells our bundling tool, in this case is Webpack, it might be something else by the time you are watching this video, because Create React App might use something different, to take all the various pieces of our app and put it together into one HTML, CSS, and JS bundle. So var destination equals document.querySelector, #container. All right, and now let's go to the React DOM.render. I like to always, because it's multiple lines, give some spacing already and add the semicolons so I don't forget it. So div /div, comma, and let's print out the word hello, just to make sure that our initial few seconds of getting this project set up is working fine. All right. So we just got our index.js set up that basically prints the words hello, or word hello, to the location designated by the #container value, which is the div element we have in our index.html. So let's go back to our page. And so notice that if you go back to the example we had earlier, the word hello is printed on screen. And that is because when I did npm start from the terminal earlier, I actually set up a watcher that Create React App already had configured for me. So any changes I make to my code will automatically show up right here. So in fact, let me actually maximize the screen and then bring up the editor on this side. So this way, you now have a very easy way of being able to both view the code and see in real time the application as it's being built. So have the code editor, and hello is displayed on screen. So right now, the thing we know is that our application kind of works. It's set up properly, and the first few parts of things we've done haven't broken anything in any terrible fashion. But now it's time to go ahead and start building our application. And mostly the UI actually. So in our source folder, create a new file called todolist.js. This is really where a lot of the work that we're going to be doing is going to take place. At least going to be the entry point. Things are going to take place. So just like before, let's go and import the React and component syntax from the library. So start with that. You'll notice that a lot of the work that we do involves importing is always the first step, and an export will be the last step, which we'll look at in a second. So class to-do list extends component. That makes sense. Render, and let's go ahead and start just putting some sample values in. We can deal with the specifics of it and talk about it in a few moments. All right, so I have my render call, and now I am returning div class name equals to-do list main. And inside of it will be div class name equals header form input placeholder equals enter task. This is going to be the way we get our to-do list to start entering information is I'm actually using a form with an input element. There are multiple ways of doing this, but that just seems convenient, mostly from this accessibility point of view, where buttons just have a lot of built-in assumptions about how they function that a screen reader or any kind of an accessibility tool can just make the most out of. You can also, of course, create your own custom work and just add up the appropriate ARIA tags to make sure they work properly. Now, I'm a stickler for the proper indentation of things. So let's go ahead and div form. Close enough. All right. So now we have our to-do list app created. Component created, and it's exported so other parts of our app can take reference to it. Okay, so here's our to-do list demo, a component, and now let's make sure that it is understood. That means we go back to index.js and import to-do list from to-do list dot. No, it's just to-do list actually. We're not doing anything beyond it. All right, and now let's replace the hello with instantiating our to-do list component. And if everything worked fine, notice that if you look at the preview on the right-hand side, you now see enter task and an add button. Doesn't do much, but it's definitely a step in the right direction, where we're now getting the functionality of our app slowly going up and running. So the initial UI is actually the easy part, because if you look at a to-do list, it's just some div elements, a form element, an input, and a button. But the rest of the app we'll have to divide up into about 5 pieces. And I'm only mentioning that right now because you want to see me jumping back and forth in a lot of code. So knowing the little pieces that are involved in making the application work will kind of help make sense of what's really probably a very dry and boring run right now of getting this application built. So the work is divided into 5 parts. One is adding items, displaying items, styling them, removing them, and the last thing is going to be animating them. So I'll start with adding items first, because why not? That seems to be the relevant thing to do. At least that's what most people do when they run into a to-do app, to-do list in the first point of view, or the first few moments of running into a to-do list. So the first thing I'm going to do is go back to to-do list, and let's deal with actually adding content. So in the form element, I'm going to add the onSubmit event, and I'm going to essentially add an event handler for onSubmit to call this thing called add item. So when the form is ever submitted, the add item method somewhere will get called. And right now, we don't have it defined anywhere, and that's okay, because we're going to go ahead and define that right now. So right now in our to-do list, we just have a render method, nothing else. But because we now want to start dealing with events and start doing other things, let's get a constructor going. Constructor, props is the only argument you need for this. And as always, you need to call the internal representation of the constructor as well, so super. And now the first thing I'm going to do is it's going to create the add item method, add item, E for the event args, and that's it. And as we've seen before, we need to bind the value of this appropriately. So this.add item equals this.add item dot bind this. All right, so we have the add item method, which is going to get called when the form is ever submitted. And then we then have the appropriate value of this that kind of makes sense when it needs to be bound to the right value. Okay, so the way we're going to be storing our items is an array, and nothing fancy there. And each time an item gets added, this array will get bigger with that item added. And each time the array gets smaller, it's because we removed a task from the list of items that we have to do. And so state seems like an appropriate mechanism for maintaining the state, as you can imagine, of the array of items we have to do. So this.state equals, and let's define the property called items, and it's going to be an empty array. Okay, so we now have the state. Now all that really remains is though getting the way of having the values from here, from our input element, somehow magically make its way into the items array. And so we saw a little bit of some of the techniques we had available in looking at how we can access the DOM from JSX. And those techniques are still going to be in play here. And so one of the things we're going to use is ref. So let me just go ahead and move the input line to the next line. So input ref equals, and there's going to be like a lot of weird brackets and parentheses and so on, and arrow function in this case. But all I'm doing is the value of the input element is going to be stored in a global variable, or actually local to this component, but accessible everywhere in this component, something called underscore input element. And then we're going to still have our placeholder, which is responsible for displaying the initial task there, because a ref is an attribute on the element itself. Okay, so if I ever want to access the contents of my form, especially the input element, I can use underscore input element. That's really the big takeaway from what's going on here. So now all that remains is populating our add item method to make sure that the value we enter somehow magically makes its way into this React's understanding of our to-do list so far. So this is going to be code that we're going to break into two parts. The first one is this. It's actually creating the item. So I'm going to do if this dot underscore input element dot value does not equal blank. So if there's an actual value here and this item is called, that means we need to actually write some code to deal with that. So I'm going to create an item, a variable called new item. A new item is an object, and it's an object because you'll see in a second why. So var new item text equals this dot underscore input element dot value, and the key, we need a key value because we're dealing with multiple items, and React really appreciates any help we can give in helping it keep track of things. So the key value is going to be date.now, which is a very precise number kind of indicating the time or number of seconds that have elapsed between now and sometime in the 1970s. And it's a good enough unique value to ensure that multiple tasks will not have the same one. So it's unique enough for what we're trying to do. Definitely more unique than using math.random, which has the ability to randomly be the same value. All right, so let's go ahead and we got this part. And so the next thing is, now we create a new item, is to go ahead and set the state of our items array to have the new value of item inside it. Now, there are multiple ways of doing it, but the way I'm going to do that is by using this.setState, and actually using the method of not mutating the state ever. I'm going to use the previous state argument and concat the value that we need. So previous state, and here it's going to go return, and it's going to be items, previous state dot items dot concat new item. And let me make sure my notes that this looks correct. Yep, this does look correct. And I can also close this in to make it look somewhat reasonable as things go. Now, what I'm doing here is the previous state argument gives me a value of our state object just before this particular moment in time has happened. And with the previous state, I'm accessing the same copy of the values and using the concat method on the array, which is a way of returning a whole new array as opposed to modifying an existing one with the newly entered item that we have right here. And what this does is it avoids mutation, and some of the things that we talk about is being undesirable when it comes to working with state. And so we just take care of that. And the last thing we're going to do inside this giant if statement is this dot underscore input element dot value equals clear. So once a value has been submitted, we're just going to go ahead and enter it and clear it out essentially. And just to make sure that the sanity check things are working fine, I'm going to console.log this dot state dot items. Okay, and then we'll start with here first. So we have our form sort of set up. Entering values now will supposedly add them to this global, local to this component, global, hand wavy global, my state object with the items array. So let's go and see how this works. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this a bit. Let's bring up the dev tools to ensure nothing is crazy going on here. Let me zoom in this as well. So if I type in hello, hit enter. And notice that as I'm typing something in and hitting enter, the page briefly refreshes, but then suddenly disappears. And that is because the default form behavior when a form is submitted is to essentially reload the contents as part of navigating to the page that's going to be dealing with the form input. We want to fix that. And so let's go back to our code and override the default behavior by calling the event argument, which is E, and then prevent default. You've probably seen this a lot in various mouse scenarios, drag scenarios, and keyboard scenarios, but form scenarios also are affected, especially if you're building a single page app and you do not want to have everything reload. Okay, so now let's go back to our console. Let's just make sure that things work fine. Enter A, B, C, D. This is typing in random characters, but notice that as I'm doing this, you can see that we're printing out the value for items array. By default, there's nothing there. Now you can see that there's an text object. Let me zoom in further if it's difficult to see. You can see A, B, C, or I skipped C, I went straight to D, but you can see that all the values that we have are now showing up properly without any kind of a problem, so which is actually really cool. And so this is a good sanity check to ensure that our code is working the way we intended for it to work, and which means we can continue and do some of the other things that we need to do as part of this. And so we have our add code, which is a good starting point, but now let's go ahead and jump to the next part. Let's display the items that have currently been entered. And so the console is a good place to show items as a developer, but if you're an end user though, right, you don't want to go to the console or have the console be the place where things happen. Let's go back to our render method, and just before the second to last div, let's reference a component called to do items entries equals, in this case, this.state.items. Okay, and don't worry, we haven't created a to-do items component yet, which is why you get the fail to compile error on the right-hand side. That is all by design because we're going to do that next. So at the very top of our page, I'm going to add an import statement. It's going to go import to-do items from /to-do items. The autocomplete isn't working right now, at least in VS Code, because the file hasn't been created yet. We'll create that in a few moments. And so now let's go ahead in our source folder, create a file called todoitems.js. We're kind of doing it in, there are multiple ways of being able to add components as you're building an app. You can do the reference later, you can do the reference afterwards. It doesn't really matter. Just as long as you're willing to ignore some of these errors that are happening as part of us building the app, you're totally fine. So let's go to the top of todoitems.js. In our source folder, it's going to be import React component and from React. And get the spacing right because you don't have to, but it's good to be consistent. And I've been using the spacing between the brackets for some of these things for a while. So class todoitems extends component. This stuff should be at this point almost like second nature to you. You should be able to recite the full syntax for defining the classes, constructors, and syntax very easily without any extra effort. So create tasks, item, and I'm going to go and put return a list of items that are going to be important. And the key is going to be item.key, and the value is going to be item.text, and I'm going to be printing out basically list value. So return list, now key equals, that's the important part to not forget, and then we get this value going. And render is going to be, now I'm going to explain what this code does. So it looks a little bizarre, but just give me a second to get all this written up, and we'll look at what exactly this does. So renders where actually all the interesting stuff happens. To do entries equals this.props.entries, and create a variable called list items, which is going to be to do entries.map this.create tasks. Okay, and so now let's go and return some values that are going to be interesting for what we're going to render on screen. So ul class name equals the list, close to unordered list element, and essentially list items. Okay, so what we're doing in our code is pretty straightforward. We now have a to-do items component that we're kind of creating, and we're trying our best to take the values that are passed in as props, which is really our state value from earlier. As you can see right here, we're calling to-do items with an entries prop whose values are essentially the full block of things in our current state object, and we're trying to print that and make it into something that we can show up on screen. And so if you look at in a render method back in to-do items, you can see we have to-do entries variable, which is essentially getting a copy of our prompts. I could have just kept this as props.entries, but I didn't, mostly just for convenience. And then I'm creating a variable called list items, which takes every item in this particular entry, which is an array, and uses the map function to essentially iterate through every item and create a list element where each item's value is the key and the text value that happens to be part of the object in the entries array that gets passed into us. And then what we're doing is we're just printing all of those on screen. So that's all that we're doing. All that remains right now is to make sure that our to-do items is understood by the bundler. So I'm going to export default to-do items. All right. And so once I've done that, you can see that the error message in our code, in our application has run away. Let's just see if it works. A, B, C, D, E. All right. So you can now see that as we're typing in stuff, the list of them is actually showing up properly. So we've gotten one step closer to getting your application in a state where we can say, all right, we're making great progress and we're almost done here. So we've been spending a lot of time adding the functionality, but as you can tell, our application doesn't really look like much. In fact, it looks awful. And let's go and fix that by adding some CSS. So back in our source folder, I'm going to create a file called todolist.css. And what's going to be in here, as you can imagine, are the various things that make what you see here look a little bit nicer and a little bit less, plain and boring. So there's going to be a lot of stuff to copy here. And so feel free to just pause and skip ahead, or provide the source code later. You can just copy directly from it. But the first thing I'm going to do is set the input element. It does not look very nice. So 10 pixels. Font size is going to be 16 pixels, so our text is going to be larger. And we'll get a nice border so it doesn't have the default browser-specific styling applied to it, which some people like. I definitely do not. And then width is going to be 165 pixels. So it's going to be hard-coded to be 165 pixels. And let's actually go ahead and see, let's actually go into this references before we go on, just so we can see live as how these changes are being manifested. So I'm going to go to todolist.js, where we have the other import statements, and just add the import to todolist.js, or CSS in this case, just so that as I'm building the app, you can start seeing some of these modifications come to life. Okay, so now you can see that the styling we added to do our CSS is showing up in our example as well. The input field is much larger, and I guess one could argue probably less usable at this very state, but it's okay. It's a work in progress. We're fixing it. So .to-do list main.header button. So now we're styling the button to look nicer. So padding 10 pixels, font size 16 pixels, margin, give it a value of 10. Let's not give it a margin right, but it's always a default margin right. I hate that one, so let's get rid of that. Some background color. It's going to be hashtag 0066FF, which means it's going to be a weird bluish color, essentially. Color is going to be white so that it shows up properly. And the border will be, again, 2 pixels, solid, 0066FF. All right, and so what we're doing here is just defining in CSS, and there are many ways you might have seen earlier from how you want to define this. You can define the CSS inline, you can define individual CSS files like I'm doing, but have it be separated by a per component basis, or you can just have one global CSS. We had index.css earlier that was being referenced. You can place all the CSS you're working on in that single CSS file. There's no right or wrong way on how you want to approach it, but I just like to keep it somewhat separate because there is something to be said about keeping your code modular and easy to find out. So in this case, if I have anything that needs to be pertaining to my to-do list, I know that this CSS file will have it, and for more complex applications, you kind of appreciate some of these separations that you do to make your code just easier to understand and debug and so on. So to-do list main dot header button hover. And define a hover color while we're at it, because why not? Since we are already going there, why not go, further in creating something that looks more professional? 003399. It's going to be a darker blue when you hover over the element, which doesn't really apply in a touch world, but we still use mouse and keyboard quite a bit, so why don't we just try to provide that? And cursor is pointer. We want to get a little hand thing going. So now if you can see to the example, I hover over the add button, you can see it changes color to a nice dark one. All right, we're almost halfway done. Actually, a little more than halfway done adding our CSS stylings. So to-do list main dot the list, and this is going to be affecting the items we're actually going to be showing up as part of the tasks. So that's good stuff. We're moved beyond the form elements to something that is actually going to affect how the tasks themselves display. And so for this, I'm going to use the for the background color, I'm going to use the RGBA function, because I want a color of white, but I want it to be partially transparent. And of course I can fiddle with the opacity, but the opacity affects the entire element. I just want the opacity of the background color to be affected. And setting the background color using RGBA is one of the easiest ways of being able to do that. So padding 15 pixels, so we can make them look a little bit larger. Margin bottom 15 pixels, so give some space between the items. And look at a border radius of 5 pixels, which gives it a nice rounded look to it. All right, so now let's go and see how this works. Add task, finish demo, hit enter. And you can now see that our demo, or at least in this case, the tasks, are appearing with some level of visual functionality. I will make some more changes to it a little bit later to get the weird bulleted list out, but for now it's okay. We'll just leave it as it is. So actually, you know what? Let's go and remove the dots right now itself. I can do this later, but why? So let's see. What is this list style? None. Does this work? Is that the current? Okay, so using list style none does end up giving us right values. And why is there a giant space here? And this is the part where I mentioned, you might see me mess up sometimes. And this is where you get to see what exactly it is that I'm doing. So I'm going to go to inspect, and let's go and see what's going on here. Oh, the list has can we actually even see it in a small screen like this? The list seems to have a padding value of 40 that I need to get rid of. Okay, well, that made it a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ahead and it's ul.thelist and padding value of 0. Okay, well, that made my job a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ul.thelist, padding is going to be 0. And oh yeah, there you go. Now in this case, the padding values have gone. So as things that I made a mistake while writing go, this wasn't the most difficult. It was pretty easy to figure out what was wrong by using the dev tools and looking at just the visual inspection functionality to see there's a padding there that needs to be removed. But crisis averted, we got it, it's been solved, and I think we can move on and pretend that this never happened. Okay, so we have the functionality for adding items. Now we need the functionality for removing them. And so the way we're going to remove items is to actually, when you click on each task, we want to give the ability for you to remove it as time goes on. And so what we're going to do is go to to-do items, and we have the create task method, right? And so I want to be able to essentially have each list element be its own event, have its own on-click event and event handler, so that clicking on each item will do the appropriate work to remove itself from the list. And so we're going to modify the return statement right here. So right now we have a list whose value is the text value from our state, and then its key value is the key attribute or the key property from our state as well. So I'm going to do list on click. I'm going to add some spacing just temporarily to break this. On click equals brackets And we're just going to put the event handler fully in line. I'm going to call, using arrow function, called this.delete and item.key. So what I'm saying is that when the delete method is called, we're going to pass in the key value of the item currently in question. So let me get the spacing right. Okay, so item list on click, called delete, and then the key and item text properties are still there. So this means that all your functionality hasn't been broken yet. You know, it might break with me adding the delete functionality, but that hasn't happened in just a second. Okay, so now that we need to do some of this work, as you can see that we're calling delete on this particular component, and we don't have any concept of binding and this and all that, which means it's time to get our constructor going. And one of the things you'll find, is that using the constructor isn't always necessary. It's actually optional. In fact, even using this whole class syntax is optional for many kinds of components that are just essentially functions. They don't need all this functionality. And we talked about that previously as well. So I'm just giving you a nod to my inefficiency in this space by doing this. So this.create tasks equals this.create tasks.bind and this. Okay, and which we've just done right now. And now it's going to be delete key. And what's going to go here is this.props.delete key. Now, what am I doing here? Why am I calling this.props.delete? Where's it going to be sent off to? This all seems bizarre, right? And what's happening is this. All to-do items is responsible for is a display of items that are currently displayed here. It has no concept of the array of, the state array object that we have and how all of the various values are currently stored and maintained. So what we really need to do is have a way of passing this value back in to our parent component, which is actually under to-do list. So I'm going to go to to-do items. Let's see, where am I? So I'm going to go to to-do list.js, and under to-do items in the render method, I'm going to add one more value. I'm going to, we saw we added the delete props earlier, or at least referencing it. Delete equals this dot delete item, which again, we haven't defined yet, but that we will do in a second. So as you're building more complex apps, you'll see that there's a lot of, gray space, I like to call it, where you have a component defined, not being used anywhere, or you're referencing a component where it hasn't been defined, or you're doing something that we're doing right now where you have the component, but you're dealing with props and prop values and the manipulation of them, which doesn't exist yet either. So you can see the order of things is entirely up to you on what makes the most sense. In this case, we define the delete method and define the equivalent way of calling it from to-do items separately, but you can do it in any kind of order that makes the most sense to you. But the important part is we have the delete, basically the delete method that passes in the key value of the item we want to remove, and then we have it actually passed in. What we really need though is a method that is handling all the delete functionality in this to-do list method so that our state is always kept up to speed. So here I'm going to delete item key, whose value comes from our to-do items component. And here I'm going to do our filtered items equals this.state.items.filter, and here's going to be function item. And I apologize for the screen size getting a little bit more compressed, not my ideal way of doing this, but I'm essentially just calling the filter method and removing any item that happens to match the key that we currently have. And one way of doing that is by using return item.key does not equals key. So let's see how this works, by the way, if it works at all. So test example, click test, and all right, what's going on here? So clearly something has currently failed. So filtered items cannot read property items of undefined. So let's see. Let's walk backwards here. We do know that this.stated items is definitely a valid entry. We also know that delete this.item is also a valid entry. So let's go back to to-do items. let's see if console.log key is plus key. So let's see if this actually even runs in the first place. So A, B, C, okay? And so now let's bring up the DevTools and see if the delete function method is even called. So here it says filtered items to send a value but never used. That could be partly related to what we were talking about right here, but let me just click a value. Okay, key is 1520. So the key value is definitely being set. So that is that's a good thing. But now this at props.delete.key is where something is going wrong. So let's go back. Let's actually read this error message that was defined earlier. To the todolist.js, filtered items is being called, but it's never actually being set. What does that mean? Oh, it could mean that by adding this filtered items functionality, I've actually never actually set the value appropriately. So this dot set state. See, sometimes the error message, reading the error message does help. This dot set state items filtered items. Okay, so maybe this is all that's missing. Return item key. Okay. See. And nope. Items of undefined. So on click, this is a delete. So this is the part where it's not very fun, as you can imagine. Okay, so let's go one step further. Let's see if the key value here makes sense. Key in delete item. Because if the key value is being properly called in delete item here, we'll at least have some knowledge that at least the hookups between the props and the components that are calling back to the props is all working fine. At least the inner component communication is working okay. Bring up the dev tools one more time. Test. Okay. We get key is here. All right. So the key value is being properly called and delete item is being properly called. All that is really broken is right here where we cannot read items of undefined. And so that is bizarre because clearly state that items is a legitimate concept right here. So console.log items at delete plus this dot state dot items. Okay. Bring up the console again and let's see what's going on. Okay, this is a simple one. And the problem is this. The value of this is completely undefined at this location. So what I need to do is make sure the value of this is bound properly. Okay, this dot delete item equals this dot delete item dot bind and this. Wow, that was unfortunate, but I am pretty optimistic that that's going to solve what we're yep, see, there you go. Items are added and you can see them getting deleted appropriately, all because we didn't get the value of this appropriately bound. So let that be a lesson. Never forget, unless you want to make the mistakes I did, do not forget to do that part. Okay, and so now let's go back to our CSS. Wow, crisis averted, right? Let's make the minor changes to deal with the styling. So it's a little bit more, at least, actually, let's go back. We already have the list method here. We just want to make sure that removing the items looks kind of nice. The first thing we're going to do is add a transition to make the background color change slightly animated. So 0.2s, ease out. And then when you hover over this element, dot each item, dot the list, colon hover, we're going to do background color. We'll just call it pink. No fancy hex value here. Cursor pointer. And this ensures that as we're adding items and hovering over it, you can see that the color transitions into a nice pink color, and clicking it removes it and things like that. You're like, what's an empty item doing here? I thought we had code to prevent that. Actually had a space character entered, so it's an empty to-do item with the space as its value, and we haven't fully dealt with that just yet. Okay, so right now we have the ability for our app to add items, remove items, but what we don't have though is a nice animation that we saw earlier. We had the ability to essentially being able to, each addition kind of zooms in, scales in, each removal removes the item, and also causes all the other items in the list to kind of just slide into view as well. Now there are many ways for you to be able to do this. You have CSS animations, you have transitions, you have request animation frame, you even have the web animations API. You have a bunch of ways of doing this. But of all the ones I've looked at, and I don't want to go into too much detail on animation here, there's one third-party library that does a really good job of just allowing you to animate the display of list items. And it's so simple that more time will be spent actually installing it from NPM than doing anything else. So let's just go back to our project. I'm going to go back to the terminal actually. Let's actually go ahead and kill this example. And so the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and compile, or actually install this new thing, which is, it's a library, which I'm calling, it's called FlipMove. And the FlipMove library is actually really cool. In fact, let me just type 2. Let's actually just get it working right now. You can see it working. It allows you to wrap your list of items, in this case our to-do list items, and then it automatically, without you having to do any extra effort, takes care of animating the addition and removal of items and doing the right thing. But what we're trying to do, that is totally fine. So let's go and install it. npm i-s react flip -move. It'll take a few moments, but it'll install it into just a list of node modules our project is currently aware of, just locally for this particular project. And it takes a few moments. All right, so we added that one package, took about 8 seconds. Great. So let's go back to VS. And so now what we're going to do is, let's see, where am I? We're in to-do list itself. At the very top, we're going to make a reference to the FlipMove library we just added. So import FlipMove from react-flipmove. Okay, so if I can spell from correctly, from react.flipmove. Okay, so now our project has some reference or some knowledge of this FlipMove component being here. And so the next thing I'm going to do is, let's see, we're in return class and to do entries. Actually, I made a mistake. FlipMove is actually not imported in to-do list. It's actually imported in to-do items, because that's actually where the items that we're dealing with live. React FlipMove, and under UL class name, here we're going to make I'm going to wrap the call to list items with FlipMove duration equals 250 milliseconds, and the multiple easing values you can provide. I'm just going to use easing equals ease out, just because that's a decent one for items that are being deleted. So FlipMove, and indent it properly, hit save. And so now if everything goes fine, I should be able to test. Okay, why isn't it working the way I thought it was going to be? Is there anything else trying me to do? No, FlipMove should have just done its thing here. So, oh, of course, and the reason is I killed my dev server. So any changes that I made are no longer being picked up. And so, hence, any change to FlipMove won't actually get picked up. Okay, so now you can see as items are added and removed, they animate in very, very nicely. Temp, blarg. Yep, everything works, and you can also adjust this, 150 might be a little too much. Let's do 150 milliseconds instead. And now let's do test. All right, this is a much snappier feel. So, feel free to adjust the values based on however you want, and know that your to-do list works just fine. All right, so there you have it. An example that we use to tie together almost everything we've used in React so far. Everything from the very basics of components to getting these things to print on screen using the render method, to all the way with state and being able to deal with eventing, and also the debugging functionality found in the React Dev tools, for the Chrome or Firefox extension, where when things go wrong, you have a bunch of ways of figuring out what happens to go wrong. Now, I'm not going to edit out the parts where I'm just struggling and trying to make sense of what happens, because the to-do list, when you're writing code on screen, the expectation really is just to get the app up and running. It isn't in any way, I think, at least the way I think right now, is it's not going to impair your ability to get the app working. It's not a tutorial in a sense where you're trying to learn a new concept, and me futzing around with all the various things here is going to distract you from being able to learn. But I do think it's valuable, though, on the flip side, to be able to understand the various pitfalls you run into as part of building an app, and some of the things that you need to do to make sure things are working. For example, not having the appropriate this value bound properly caused at least a good 3-4 minutes of me thinking that some of my other code was actually broken. And also at the very end, we saw that why wasn't our page updating? If you're using npm start and running a live version of the app, and if you ever kill the server as part of, like, let's say, installing a dependency like we did, restarting it is important. Otherwise, any changes you make will not actually get picked up. And if you're used to that functionality, you might wonder why is something actually working. So really, though, the to-do list app is pretty simple what it does, but by building it from scratch like we did, we covered almost every little interesting detail React brings to the table. And not only that, we combine them to create something that works. And really, the challenge for you is there any part of this video that did not make sense? Is there any concept that we looked at that you're like, I don't think I've seen it before? If so, I highly suggest you go back and watch some of the earlier videos that we have, or just go to crew.com and read the tutorials, or check out some of the other things that are on the web in general about some of these things that you're not familiar with. If you run into any issues, feel free to post in the forums at forum@crew.com. As you've seen from this particular video, there's a very good chance that I run into every single issue as part of building it that you're probably running into as well. Just post there, and I'll be happy to reply and get you unblocked. Tell your friends and enemies all about this so that they can learn to build a to-do list app as well, especially if they owe you things and they think they might have forgotten. The to-do list app will help them keep track of them. Hit subscribe to be notified of new videos in this series. Follow me at Karupa on Twitter to see interesting things that I find interesting. Interesting things that I find interesting makes a lot of sense. As you can tell, we're reaching the end of this video, so I'm just like turning my brain off very slowly. And of course, check out my book, Learning React. It's really popular, people really like it, and it covers the to-do list app you saw here, along with a few other examples that kind of tie in more of the fun things that React, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS have in this giant blob of things you need to know to build something meaningful these days. And with that, I will see you guys next time.